When I was in medical school, I was obsessed with finding the most efficient and effective way to learn medicine. And this wasn't just so that I could do better in exams, but also so that I had extra time and energy and effort to put into those extracurricular activities and those extra things that I really enjoyed doing. Part of this obsession with learning led me to do an intercalated degree in psychology, just so that I could understand better how people learn and what techniques might be useful in order to improve learning and make things more efficient and effective. And that's where I came across something called the testing effect. And in this video, I'm going to be talking all about why testing is so important for your learning. And it's useful in preparing for any type of exams, but particularly useful in this scenario in preparing for medical school exams. So to be as helpful as possible, I'm going to put all the topics we're going to talk about on this side of the screen along with timestamps so that you can skip ahead if there's anything particularly that interests you. If not, you can watch the whole video through and we'll cover everything and it will make more sense. So we're going to start by talking about why testing is so important, and that involves talking about the forgetting curve, introducing you to something called the testing effect, and also looking at why testing might work and what methods of testing might be more effective. And then in the second part of the video, I'm going to be talking about how to use testing to maximize your learning, to maximize the effect of testing on your learning. And this involves talking about a concept that I've come up with called the testing sandwich, which is a technique I've been using since A-levels. And whenever I've done really well in exams, it's because I've used this technique of the testing sandwich. And then also I'm going to talk about tracking your testing and why that's so important and why it can be useful. So let's get straight into this video and into the good stuff. Now let's start by talking about a concept called the forgetting curve. And I want to introduce you to somebody called Hermann Ebbinghaus, who was a German psychologist and lived from 1850 to 1909. Ebbinghaus was really interested in memory, and what he did was experiment on himself by learning syllables and then testing himself to see how much of those syllables he could remember. And the research findings that Ebbinghaus produced were actually published after his death in English in a book called Memory, A Contribution to Experimental Psychology in 1913. And I've read through this book and it's quite dry, to be honest with you, and a bit difficult to understand, but I wanted to introduce you to one really key concept, which is called the forgetting curve. You can see a cutout from his book up here, which is some of the experiments that he did on himself. And it might not make much sense when you first look at it, but essentially what this is showing is him learning syllables and then the time after he learned syllables that he tested himself, and then the percentage of those syllables that he forgot in that time between learning them and testing himself. And if you plot this on a graph, which I've done here, you get the forgetting curve. Now this forgetting curve is only really applicable with the exact figures we've got here to Ebbinghaus's studies on himself. But it gives us an idea that over time, whenever you learn anything, you forget that. And intuitively, you'll know this yourself. You forget very quickly to start with, and then that kind of plateaus and you remember about 20% of what you originally learnt. Another important finding that Ebbinghaus made was that when he learned those syllables again for a subsequent time, the forgetting curve, or how quickly he forgot things, actually became more mellow. So he managed to retain more of that information with more repetitions. And when he tested himself again and again, learning those things over and over again, he found that he retained that information even longer, which essentially means that the more repetitions of learning something that you do, the longer you'll retain that information, and the slower you'll forget that information. So repetition is key. Next, I want to talk about something called the testing effect. And this is a really powerful phenomenon that's found in the psychology research and has been proven again and again and again to be a really effective way of learning information and retaining that information in your memory. So I want to tell you about one paper by somebody called Rodinger and Carpike from 2006. And what they did is they took 130 undergraduate psychology students, and if you know anything about psychology research, you'll know that essentially all they do is test undergraduate psychology students. And they had these students read through passages on either the sun or sea otters. And they split these psychology students into two groups. They had one group study the passage and then after 2 minutes study the passage again, and they had the other group study the passage and after 2 minutes test themselves by actively recalling as much as they could about that passage. And then after a period of time, they tested the students on how much they could remember from that passage. And they did this by asking them to recall as much of the information in the passage as they could. And they tested them at one of 3 different time points, either 5 minutes after learning the passage, 2 days after learning the passage, or 1 week after learning the passage. And what they found was the students that studied the passage twice did the best at 5 minutes, but at the 2-day and the 1 week interval, the students that studied the passage and then tested themselves did better than the students who studied the passage twice. And this showed that testing yourself after studying a passage was more effective at long-term retention of that information than studying the passage twice. But what the researchers did was they went one step further, and they took 180 students and they had them study passages again. But this time they split them into 3 groups. And these groups were students who studied the passage 4 times in a row. The second group was students who studied the passage 3 times and then tested themselves. And the final group was students who studied the passage once and then tested themselves 3 times. So they only got to look at the passage once, but then had to test themselves on the passage 3 times. Again, they tested the students to see how much they remembered at 5 minutes and at 1 week. And what they found was, at 5 minutes, the students who studied the passage more times had a better retention of that information. But at 1 week, the students who tested themselves 3 times did by far the best, followed by the students who studied 3 times, then tested themselves. And the worst were the people who studied the passage 4 times. So this really clearly shows that if you want to retain information for a longer period of time, you really need to be testing yourself on that information. Otherwise, your memory is going to be much worse than somebody who is testing themselves. And it's not often that we revise for an exam 5 minutes before the exam. It's usually a week before, or 2 weeks, or even longer. So I want to talk about one more study that might be quite useful for illustrating how powerful the testing effect is. And that's Carpenter et al. From 2008. And what Carpenter et al. Did was they took 13 and 14-year-old students who were studying US history facts. And they split them into 3 groups. One group that studied the facts once, one group that studied the facts twice, and one group that studied the facts once and then tested themselves on those facts afterwards. And they tested how much of these US facts the students could recall at 1 week and at 16 weeks. So this was a very long period of time between when they studied the facts and when they were tested. And what they found was that by far the students who tested themselves retained way more information than the students that restudied or the students that only studied once. So again, this really well illustrates how powerful this testing effect is, even over long periods of time, like 4 months. And if you're interested in this research, there's countless studies that you can go out and look at which will demonstrate this testing effect over and over again. So I hope that really convinces you that testing is something you really need to be doing if you want to retain information for your exams. So why is testing so effective? Well, there's loads and loads of theories about why it's so effective, but I subscribe to 2 of them because they intuitively make the most sense for me. The first reason is that you're training your brain to retrieve that information. You're essentially practicing how to recall that information. So when you're studying and you're reading from a book, all you're doing is practicing how to take information in, but you're not actually practicing how to retrieve that information and take it out. And then when you're in the exam scenario, all you're trying to do is try to retrieve that information from your brain. And if you haven't practiced that, you won't be very good at it. The second theory about why testing works is something called effortful retrieval. And what this essentially means is that when you try and retrieve information, this takes quite a lot of effort for your brain. And that effort helps to strengthen the connections of those memories and help them stick for a longer period of time. And interestingly, what the research has shown is that the more effort you put into retrieving that information, the longer that effect will last and the more powerful that effect will be. What they found is that recall is more powerful than recognition. So this raises the question, Should we be using short answer questions or complete active recall of the information you've just studied? Or should we be using multiple choice questions to learn, where you simply have to recognize an answer from a list rather than produce that answer from scratch? And I know if you're doing short answer questions or you're trying to actively recall all the information you've just learned from scratch, that's going to take a lot more effort than quickly flicking through some multiple choice questions and picking out the answer that looks correct. And that extra effort might help to solidify those memories and make the testing effect more powerful and last longer. The other interesting thing that the research has shown is that spaced retrieval is more powerful. So if there's a longer space from when you studied the information to when you tested yourself on that information, that's more powerful for having a longer lasting testing effect and better retention of information. And this is probably because there's a big gap between when you studied it and when you tested yourself on it, which makes the test more difficult because you have to remember something you studied a longer time ago. And this fits in with something called the spacing effect, which I'll talk about in a later video, which is also another powerful way to learn medicine and retain information for longer. Now, I talked briefly about whether short answer questions or completely actively recalling things is more powerful and more useful than multiple choice tests, but I would suggest you should still do multiple choice questions because you're practicing the same retrieval techniques for that information that you're going to be using in your exams. Most medical exams are multiple choice question exams, so you want to practice the same exam technique and the same process to get your brain used to that type of thinking in preparation for your exams. Finally, another reason I think testing is so important is because of feedback loops. And I think about feedback loops a lot. And if you're learning anything, whether it's learning a foreign language, learning a new sport, learning to play an instrument, anything you want to learn, you need a feedback loop in order to learn it. Without having a feedback loop that tells you whether you're on the right track, whether you're doing the right things, whether you're getting better or you're getting worse, you'll never know which direction you're going in, and there's a real risk of things actually getting worse or not getting any better at all. When you're learning medicine, if you're just reading textbooks, highlighting notes, making illustrations, watching videos, listening to lectures, anything like that that's passive, how do you know whether your skills and your knowledge are improving and you're actually getting better? You're not having any feedback that tells you you're on the right track or you should be doing something differently. When you start testing yourself, you can actually track how well your knowledge is improving. And this is really important in giving you feedback to tell you whether you're on the right track or whether you need to do something differently. And it also tells you which areas that you're strong in and which areas you're weak in and where you should focus your energy the most. So we talked about a lot of the theory about why testing is such an effective way to learn medicine and to learn any skill. Next, we need to talk about how to use testing to prepare for medical exams, to learn medicine, or to learn any skill or any subject in preparation for any type of exams. Firstly, I want to introduce you to a concept that I've used since A-levels that's been really effective for me. And anytime I've done really well in an exam, it's usually because I've put this concept into practice. And anytime I've done less well is when I've tried something else or some other type of technique for preparing for that exam. And this is something I call the testing sandwich. The first step to do this testing sandwich approach is to split whichever subject you're learning for your exams, whatever's going to come up on your exams, into different topics that you can study in, say, 30 minutes to 2 hours, whatever you can sit down and study in one block of time. So, for example, for my medical school finals, I split this into cardiology, respiratory, gynecology, vascular surgery, and so on, these big topics. But I had enough notes on these topics that I could just go through them in maybe half an hour to an hour and a half or 2 hours. Once you have a set of notes on these topics that you can sit down and revise in half an hour to 2 hours, then you need 2 sets of questions, 2 banks of questions for each topic. The first type of question is short answer questions. So anything that will give you a little question that you have to use to recall some key information. And the second type of question is an MCQ question bank that covers that topic. So for example, questions on cardiology, in a short answer question format, and then an MCQ bank that has a set of questions on cardiology as well. And here is the concept of the testing sandwich. In a study block, in a study session, when you're going to cover one topic, let's say gynecology, what you do is, first of all, you test yourself on the short answer questions, then you study from the notes that you have, and then you test yourself on the MCQs on those questions. So you sandwich that study session with two sets of questions either side. First, let's start by talking about the short answer questions that you do before you study the topic. And there's a number of benefits for doing short answer questions before studying. And these are, firstly, it provides you with a really good baseline to know exactly where you're starting from. How good is your knowledge on that topic before you even study it? Secondly, it gives you some effortful retrieval from the previous time you studied that topic. So let's say you studied that topic a month ago and you're doing questions on it now. That's going to cause a lot of effort for your brain to try and remember the information that you studied a month ago, which will help to solidify the connections and the memories of that information in your brain. And the third reason to do these short answer questions before you get started is it really primes your brain to pay attention to the information. I'm sure you can remember a time where you got something wrong in an exam or in some sort of scenario where you were being tested, and then after that you remember that information for ages because it really stands out in your mind. Because you initially had that feedback loop that told you got it wrong, your brain paid a lot more attention to that information and the memory became a lot longer lasting. So the next question is, what format should these short answer questions or these initial questions that you do before you study the information take? Well, what I would recommend is just having a very short question that asks you for a key word or a key fact or a guideline or some sort of short list of information that you can easily do very quickly and will be able to tell you yes or no whether you got the answer correct. And a good example of this is the Instagram posts or the flashcards from the Zero to Finals that I've created. One of my missions with Zero to Finals is to try and tick all the boxes to provide all the materials that you need to get started with your revision. So I'll show you an example of these flashcards. Essentially what they are is, on one side of the card you have a series of questions and key facts that it's asking you for, and you know from the questions how many points you need to give. And then on the back you have those answers, and you can quite easily see whether you're correct or incorrect with the answers that you've put down. You can also make your own set of questions, which is what I did for finals, where you just create a list of questions and then on a separate piece of paper or on the reverse of that piece of paper you have a list of answers. This works just as well. So how should you use these questions? Well, what I recommend is you go through all of the questions one by one and write down the answers on a separate piece of paper. And then, once you've done all the questions, check the answers and add up all of your scores. So add up the questions that you got right and add up all the points that you missed, and then calculate a percentage score for what you got on those questions. The next part of the testing sandwich is to go through the notes that you've collected on that topic. So let's say you're going through notes on endocrinology. And for a good example, I'll use the Zero to Finals notes, which you can find in the Zero to Finals books or on the Zero to Finals website at zerotofinals.com/learn. And when you're going through these notes, what I suggest is you don't just read them passively or even make your own set of notes along the side of them, is that you cover them up with a piece of paper or something else. And as you go through, you slowly pull that piece of paper down. And every time you get to a point where you are prompted for what's coming next, you write down everything you can remember about that point before you go on. So let's say you're studying notes on acute asthma and you get to the acute asthma page and you start bringing the piece of paper down and it reveals the title presentation. So now you think to yourself, what is the presentation of acute asthma? How would I expect a patient to present in my exams? And what you do is you write down everything you can think of, for example, shortness of breath, wheeze, the chest feeling tight or sounding tight on auscultation, and maybe the use of some accessory muscles. And then you uncover the information in the book or on your notes, and you check to see how much you've got right and how much you've got wrong. And then you can fill in the gaps in your memory, and this will stand with you for a lot longer than just passively reading. It's a much more active way of reading the information. The final step of the testing sandwich is to do MCQ practice. And you can find MCQ banks all over the internet. There's some questions on zero to finals which do need updating, but there's loads of good question banks out there that you can use to test your knowledge. And when you go through these questions, you just want to do questions on the topic that you've just studied. For example, if you studied respiratory, you just want to do the respiratory questions. And there's a few benefits to doing these MCQ questions after you've just studied the information. Firstly, MCQ questions tend to give you a scenario and describe a presentation, and then ask you to apply your clinical knowledge and skills to work out what's going on, to either give a diagnosis or a management plan or suggest some investigations. So this is a good way to take the knowledge you've just learned and put it into practice. The second benefit to doing some MCQ questions at this point is that you're actually practicing the same process that you're going to go through when you sit your MCQ exams in medical school. So it's useful to actually practice the skill that you're going to be applying. The third benefit is that it gives you that study test effect that I described from the literature earlier on in this video. And the final benefit is it offers you another way to track your learning and track how well you're getting on. So it provides you another feedback loop to see whether you've actually paid attention when you're studying and whether your knowledge is improving over time. The final thing I want to talk about in this video is tracking. And it's essential to track the test results that you're getting so that you know how you're progressing. And what I recommend is creating a tracking table for all the topics that you've decided on that are coming up in your exams. I recommend having a list of topics on the left with each review next to it. This includes the date of the review, the short answer question results that you got, and then the MCQ question results that you got. There's a whole bunch of benefits to tracking your test results, and I'm going to do a full video all about tracking and why it's useful and how to use it in an upcoming video. So if you want to be notified when that video comes out, definitely subscribe to the channel and it'll let you know when it comes out. Some of the key benefits to tracking your testing is that it lets you know where you're up to and how good your knowledge is at that point, which is really useful for guiding your revision going forward so that you can focus on the weak areas and maybe spend less time on the strong areas. It's useful to see your progress as things go on, and this means you can adapt your revision in a dynamic way. Rather than planning your revision schedule in advance and then following a plan, if you're tracking your learning, you can look back and see where you've come from and adapt dynamically to work out what you should be studying today, rather than being dictated to by a revision schedule that you created a couple of weeks ago. And finally, whenever I've used a tracking table, it's been really motivating because I can actually see this table expanding and see myself getting better at things and see in a visual format all the work that I've done up until that point, which helps to keep me motivated and gives me a real sense that I'm accomplishing something. So thank you for watching this video. I'd be really grateful if you could hit the like button just to help the channel grow and to encourage me to keep creating more videos. If you want to be notified when more videos come out, do subscribe to the channel. I'll be making lots of videos about how best to study for medical exams, and it can be applied to any exams in general as well. So I'll be covering things like the spacing effect, how to use tracking tables to optimize your learning, amongst various other things. So do consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time.